I've just been on 2 hours of calls, so just to maybe share that I kind of not expected or necessarily prepared for being interviewed, but happy for you guys to keep this record.
It's very formal, Jon, and it's not gonna be publicized as an interview. It's just really a qualitative kind of research that we are doing. Okay.
Okay.
So Santiago, would you start?
So, Jon, yes, I think we can maybe trying to think in all the moments that we have been working in all the projects, and I think your point of view maybe it's very useful to make more deep these reflections, I think. So I think the first question is around the difference between global south and global north, and global north. Sorry. I don't know, what do you think are the main difference? We have been working in maybe in 3 categories, like difference in the cultural level, in the political and social level, and operational level. So I don't know if what do you think about this difference? What do you think what are the principal difference between the global south and global north around the practices in deliberative democracy?
Yeah, so thank you, Santiago. So first of all, one thing I really appreciate that the headline of this notebook, when I last read, I kind of skimmed through it about a week ago, and it indicated that global south is understood as a political concept, which I really appreciate. And I feel like it's very dangerous if we I hope it's okay to say that I work and live in the global south for my entire adult life. I mean, of course, I'm originally from the United States, sort of settler colonial society. But I see myself much more associated with like my community and life in Rwanda, where I've worked in the government and spent my entire sort of professional career. And I find it dangerous when we use global south and global north as descriptive concepts to kind of divide, and it's really unclear to me where we draw those lines. But I think if we were, I think I broadly understand it. I do really worry how oftentimes these terms just like replace previous terms that I think we all find really distasteful: developing world, third worlds, etc. And it's preferable rhetorically, but I think it's still problematic as sort of ontologically to the world. And that's something that our team at Eye for Policy feels really strongly about. We try to really avoid using these terms with the Global Assembly, for example, majority world, global south, global north. So that's one. I think in terms of, as kind of a framing, in terms of the key differences, so first of all, like what I understand as the global north and the way it's often utilized, I feel like the global north is much more homogenous than the global south. There's like a much more common understanding of what democracy is, this sort of electoral representative form. You kind of have like a common sort of copy pasting of the French and American constitutions in variety of forms, or the British lack of constitution, but sort of constitutional norms, if you will. Whereas the global south has kind of this like hodgepodge of, first of all, the colonial imperial experience of having these constitutions just like imposed upon them through imperialization, colonization. So a lot of the sort of post-colonial period has been a process of sort of trying to adapt, in many cases, constitutions that were kind of given to or adapted to, which I feel like is really important. But I think in general, the global south is a much more heterogeneous like space. And I think it's important to recognize that when we think about, for example, the African continent, you could argue that the African continent is more diverse than the rest of the human population combined, that there's more genetic diversity between Africans than between any other human population on planet Earth. There's more linguistic diversity in the African continent than the rest of the human population combined, arguably more linguistic diversity. And so you look at countries like Uganda, there are arguably 40 to 70 pre-colonial nations that existed in Uganda before colonization. And this gets like amalgamated into a singular modern nation state. So I think, yeah, I think for me, like diversity, heterogeneity is like the main difference in the global South. And I think it's difficult for when we think of global South as a political concept. I'm really aligned, and I see that you mentioned this concept from Arturo Escobar of the pluriverse, and I find it's really important to embed our thinking as global South in that context of diversity and difference and recognizing their different worldviews. I think I don't Felipe, and I'm now really inspired to go and read more about the tropicalization concept that Felipe's introduced. But I do feel like in general, global South organizations are less inclined to, first of all, colonize deliberative practice. I feel like even the Global Assembly, and I speak really candidly here, and I feel like I'm in a safe space with you and the researchers, but I feel like even the current version of the Global Assembly reports, and we've submitted the comments that say exactly this, and I'm waiting to see how these are going to be addressed. But I feel like a lot of the innovations that are actually from the global South have been characterized as global North innovations. And I don't think oftentimes global South innovations are recognized. Like, for example, a global South organization, the Global Assembly, our organization based in Africa, developed the hand signals for the Global Assembly. These were tested in the lab, and they were used in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I don't think it's not often where then, the Europeans are like, we learned this from an African organization and the experience of the Global Citizens Assembly. Even in the report of the Global Assembly, it doesn't even recognize that. It actually gives full credit for the kind of intellectual contributions of the Global Assembly to the Global North, which is completely factually incorrect and false. And I think we have a lot of these experiences where this idea of kind of innovation, it kind of rests in the global North, and that's just completely false. And I feel like that's something I'm really excited about what you guys are doing to hopefully try and mitigate some of that tendency. And I think as global South organizations, we're often not, maybe it's the humility, but I feel like we're often not claiming credit for the things that we're doing. And I think other organizations in the global North are often inclined to take credit for the work that we're doing. I think the second thing is that we're also not inclined to try and create universalities because we're so we live in situations that are so diverse. Even within our own nation state context or in our own cities, there's so many different worldviews that exist. So we're not very inclined to say these to talk about what we need to be doing in deliberative democracy. So it's, I think, another tendency is just kind of the way in which intellectual contributions are, first of all, claimed and like sort of ascribed or attributed. Sorry, Celia, you want to say something? Oh, you're on mute.
No, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, sorry, maybe it's my connection.
I wanted to ask you in this regard, if you think that there is some difference and this humility and this diversity that you are talking and this kind of not claiming for regarding the participatory legacy, participatory history, do you feel there are some differences like related to social movements, for community participation? Do you feel in your experiences there are differences between organized civil society in the global South, in Africa, or in the countries that you have worked, and in the global North? Do you see something like that? Do you observe something like that? The way that the civil society, organized civil society work or act?
I love this expression from Arundhati Roy, the Indian writer. She says that civil society organizations are the indicator species for neoliberal devastation. And I think that the kind of formalization of civil society is oftentimes driven from quote unquote global north institutions and organizations, funding dynamics, etc. And I think that's really problematic. I feel like there are a lot of movements that share a lot of similarity between the global north and the global south. For example, if you think about, like, I think labor movements, for example, share a lot of similarity between global north and global south. I think unfortunately, when we start looking, you know, and a lot of political movements and advocacy groups also share, I think, a lot of similarity. But when we look at civil society organizations, I think, at least, and I can't speak to this quantitatively, but my feeling is that global north and civil society organizations in our democracy space are oftentimes funded by global north funders. And I feel like our organizations in the global south often have a lot of our funding from global north institutions also. And that creates a lot of really perverse incentives. It creates a lot of, you know, and we all have the experience of a funder coming with, they characterize a problem in a particular way. In some cases, they can be very offensive or very, like, narrow-minded or very ignorant. And we try to, like, okay, yes, we understand what you're trying to say here. We can offer a project. But I think there's oftentimes a lot of kind of mimicry of global north priorities within global south institutions in this space because of the funding dynamics. And I think that the funding dynamics in a way cause that. And that's something I see, at least in our space. And I know, for example, this is, you know, like, Instituto gets funding from, you know, Colombian foundations and governments. Same Mediamos, you guys work with the Bogota City Council. I know Sylvia's same, but, you know, for us, it's also the same. We work with a lot of governments. We work with the African Union. But even in a lot of cases when we're working with African governments or with African institutions, the institutions. You know, so, like, we have a project right now building out a tech platform for the African Union. The funding for that comes from Europe. You know, and one of the things that we're doing, and I think you guys might find this really exciting, is that we have a new grant agreement with the European Commission. And the European Commission, it's called a Digital Innovation Bridge is the name of the project. And they wanted to see exchange. And so we said, okay, then we need to have knowledge exchange from Africa to Europe. It's not just money from Europe to Africa and expertise to Africa, but the European Commission is hiring our African team to deliver trainings in Europe to European policymakers. And we find that really beautiful. And that was, for us, kind of philosophically really important if we're engaging in this project. Yes, we want to learn from what Europe has to teach, but we also have a lot of learnings that we want to teach to Europe. And that's been integrated into this grant agreement, for example. And it's something that we're trying to do more of and trying to be really attentive of. But I think, just to answer your question, Sylvia, I think that's maybe the major difference is, like, in a way, the perversion of, like, where the funding comes from and the kind of the priorities that those fundings kind of set for us in some cases.
Nice.
Okay, Jon, I think this is very useful, that ideas that you give to us. And now that you have mentioned this process between Africa and Europe, and also the Global Assembly, I want to ask you if do you consider that those are process that we can understand like mutual learning process between North and Global South, or do you know if there is any other process that we can consider with this category of mutual learning? We are trying to understand the mutual learning process like a non-coercive process, also a process that the South can bring some practices and learnings from this experience to the North, and the North can give some learnings to the South, but with a relation non-coercitive relation. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
thank you. Sergio. I mean, I think this point about non-coercion is really important because, I mean, the reason why these terminologies exist is because the like intrinsic power dynamic in the relationship, sort of former colonizer, the trading relationships that are a legacy of that, the kind of financial transactions embedded in this sort of global north, sort of developed global development framework that I think Arturo Escobar also speaks really beautifully about, creates like difficult situations where it's really hard to say that these relationships are not, like, power is always present. And I think even in the Global Assembly, for example, power was really present. It was exercised in very complicated and nuanced ways. It wasn't linear, etc. But I think these power relationships are always present. You know, proximity of global north partners to the funding, to the researchers, to the headquarters of organizations always creates these kinds of perverse realities that we need to be very attentive of. And I think this always exists. I can imagine even in a project like the one that you're working on, that, you know, even if it doesn't exist, and it's because you guys were really attentive about trying to decolonize the project, for example, but these things are always present. And so, yeah, I would say, like, you know, first of all, I think the Global Assembly, I think it was beautiful. I think there was a lot of solidarity in the way that people participated. And I think it was sort of a learning in action, because we were kind of building something as we were moving. You know, we were testing through labs, we were applying new techniques. I think a lot of innovations emerged from the Global Assembly that you could attribute to all over the world. Yeah, I would think in terms of other groups, I mean, there are these networks. I mean, obviously Democracy R&D, People Powered is another, I think, beautiful network. There are challenges, I mean, of course, with these networks all basically being headquartered in the global north and their funding coming mainly from the global north. I guess DRD is a little bit different in that regard because it comes from membership fees from communities around the world, at least partially. I mean, what mainly comes to mind are projects that we're working on at the moment. So I mentioned this Horizon 2020 grant. That's one. I think it's a really great example of that. It's also complex. The funding comes from Europe, but we've structured a really nice consortium. So it's called the African European Digital Innovation Bridge. It's a Horizon 2020 grant. We have a couple of other projects where this is being built in. And then I think two projects that we have upcoming that would be really interesting, I think, for this project. First is we're organizing a first meeting of something we call the Governance Vocabularies Initiative. And that's being launched by I4Policy together with the School of Collective Intelligence in Morocco. And we're going to organize an initial meeting. And the idea is to open this up, so it's not something that's like driven by one or two organizations. But the idea is that we find a challenge in the kind of proliferation of governance vocabularies and standards. You know, you have different groups saying this is the deliberative democracy standard, and this is how we call this, and this is how we call that. And so what we want to do is we want to create an initiative to bring people together to sort of surface these different terminologies and create a way to, we're not trying to then like impose a new standard. We're not trying to kind of replace a proliferation of universal standards with the new perfect universal standard. The idea is to take a pluriversal approach. And so what we want to do is we want to create a governance vocabularies API. So in the way that an API creates like a protocol to like sort of translate and to communicate between different standards. So you're not trying to sort of impose a new standard, but to create a way in which people can sort of create their own standard and then connect that standard to what other people are doing in a particular topic or framework. And it's really clear, like, you have different repositories of democratic innovation, like Participedia, like People Powered's building a toolkit, and, you know, Meta Governance Project and many others. And they all have different filters for sort of identifying methods or cases. And we want to basically, those filters are essentially ontological frameworks. Like, these are different definitions of how you might describe democracy innovation that you could use to find what you're looking for. So this already creates like different sort of democratic governance ontologies that we can create an API to speak to. So when you're in the Participedia database, if we create this API, you could then find methods and cases from other repositories because you create like a way of linking the different definitions to others. Sorry, you've got your, sorry, Sylvia, I saw your hand up.
You hear me?
Yeah, yeah. You're a bit quiet for me. I didn't hear you before.
Yeah. EPI, what is, I'm sorry, what is for this EPI? What is
No,
it?
no, it's the API is essentially like a software development terminology. And
Oh,
I'm sorry, it's let me just look up the actually what it means. And because I think maybe there's just a different, so it's
mhm.
application programming interface.
Oh,
I'm just gonna pull up a wiki. I'm sure it's just a question of translation.
no, it's because I'm very bad in technology, so good.
So
API.
yeah, I just shared the link. And so the API, it's like a programming language. And essentially what it does is it creates a sort of protocol to link two different types of software. And so what you could do is you could link like, let's say a database on repositories, but you could also link like, let's say, a particular organization's deliberative democracy standards or whatever, and create a way for those to all speak to each other. And so it's essentially a way of creating like a pluriversal standard. So we're not imposing what the new standard of governance vocabulary is. We're offering like an API for anyone to be able to link and learn. So we get the benefits of standardization because there are a lot of benefits of standardization. If everyone's using the same terminology, we can share knowledge together, we can learn together. And so we think this API will create like hopefully a way to standardize without recreating this kind of hegemonic reality of what democracy is and giving the benefit of that to some small constellation of actors as it's been in the past.
You have talked like in another context about adaptation of constitutions. How do you see this idea of adaptation for deliberative democracy, for citizen deliberation? How do you see that? Like you said, innovation. What would be the difference for you between innovation and adaptation? Or is there are just two names for the same thing, depending on who is talking about?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Sylvia. I think there is a lot of kind of inherent power in who names in versus who names adaptation, definitely, that I think we have to be really mindful of. I think it's really important to recognize. And it's like similar to what I was saying before, that kind of Global North is able to kind of claim that their work is innovative, but how often do they attribute innovation to the Global South? I think that the reality of like when we really have to kind of zoom out a little bit, I think, from deliberative democracy and participatory democracy and like methodologies like a citizens assembly, and recognize that what we're ultimately talking about is a technology of human collaboration. All these things are just like ways in which humans come together in a space. It's not software. It's like it's the real human interaction in the protocols that sort of mediate that. The norms or the rules of like who speaks first and what are the kind of how are we going to go into breakout groups and at what points and when is there a learning journey and all this stuff. And it's like, we can get more and less fancy about how we characterize methodologies and these things, but ultimately all of these things, like these innovations, belong to humanity. I mean, this is what we as a species do, is we collaborate together. When we think about the history of our species for like, if we want to zoom out like 100,000 years, the point in time where like humanity started leaving the African continent and kind of settling planet Earth and kind of in a way colonizing geographic space that was occupied by others, and it's occupied by other human species in a sort of recurring phase of imperialism and colonization. I feel like all of these things, like personally, I find it ridiculous that, you know, Stanford or Jim Fishkin would have like a a trademark on deliberative polling, for example, because it's just like, what is it? It's asking people a question, then it's getting them to fill a survey poll and then doing a pre and post survey. Like, I think this is just the best example of like how ridiculous it is to like claim kind of authorship or innovation for methodologies, because these things are oftentimes very minimally adapted from others. You know, the difference between a citizens assembly and a lot of other deliberative formats. And then, you know, I feel like the difference between citizens assemblies and other deliberative formats is often equal to the amount of diversity we see between citizens assemblies, for instance, because there's a huge diversity between citizens assemblies. And then you have groups coming in saying, no, it can only be a citizens assembly if it follows this particular standard set by an organization, often in the global north. And so, yeah, I do find it like, it's a very tricky thing to say what's super innovative. I mean, even earlier I was saying that, you know, we innovated on hand signals, but of course we're just borrowing that from social movements and other activities that we as an organization were doing in other spaces, and then just adapting it to the citizens assembly deliberative democracy space. Is it innovative because no one else has made that adaptation before? I think you're absolutely right, Sylvia. I think it's just depending on who's doing it. You know, if it's done by us, then it's adaptation. If it's done by someone in the global north, it's often innovation, and they trademark it.
Yes. We have been talking about innovation within the innovation, democratic innovation. Like you are, yes. We are not, at least in our experiences, we are never doing exactly in the same way that we learned and we read about in the guides and listened about in Democracy R&D Global North, right? You are doing always something different. So it's adaptation, it's innovation. We don't know. And regarding that, I don't know, Santiago, if I'm jumping in, but please go ahead with the questions. I was just trying to get to the, like you have so many different projects with so many different communities and contexts and goals. What have you been the experiences that you think you or your team learned more about how to do a collaboration process? Do you remember the best learning experiences that you had doing your job, doing your projects?
I think it's all about learning by doing. I mean, to be honest, in my experience, like, you know, I don't think none of our experiences have ever come copy paste from a book or Global North or whatever. A lot of it's about following, you know, our intuition, you know, and I think that's one of the things that's really, I don't think that we celebrate enough about the Global Assembly, for instance. Like a lot of the little adaptations that we were developing at the time, nobody's done a transnational deliberation before, not at that scale, not at that level of complexity, you know, not about that you know, like just so many elements of complexity, and like, you know, things about, for example, I think this is the first time that a citizens assembly started in breakout groups rather than plenary. I don't know of another experience where you would start a citizens deliberation in a small group rather than in the big group. And the reason why we did that was because of the idiosyncrasies of the group. We were really trying to adapt the methodology to be useful for the particular requirement and the particular group of people. And I think that's always the case in our organization. And I think and if anything, it's like the agency of our organization and our team to feel like we can do that, I think is important. And sorry, I don't know if my internet's cutting. I just heard a bit of noise. I'm not sure if someone else is trying to ask something or speak. Sorry. No.
No, I think it was an internet problem. But
sorry guys. But I think, you know, like this to me is like, it's a small thing, you know, but like we started the Global Assembly in plenary or in breakout groups because more than a third of the members had never been on a video call before in their lives. And we wanted them to feel more safe before going into the big room. And we felt it would be more productive to kind of create that small group cohesion, create that small group safety, embed some of the practice about the Global Assembly, embed some comfort about the Global Assembly, some knowledge about the Global Assembly before going into the big group. And we didn't follow a guide. We didn't even need to look at anything. We just did what the project needed and then asked, is this the best way to do something? And I think that's always how we work. And I think, you know, a lot of the literature on like innovation and creativity recognizes that like constraints are an important driver of innovation and creativity. And so I think all of these processes have different constellations of constraints, whether they're in the global north, the global south, whether they're in Brazil or Rwanda or Nigeria, or, you know, we work in countries where you have sort of a, you know, a very strong rule of law and very clear constitutional norms and electoral representative democracy. We worked in, and it's of course extremely sad. Sorry, like, wow, sorry. Even just thinking about it for a moment just makes me feel extremely sad. But working in, for example, Sudan, we were working with like the transitional revolutionary movement and working with young people about creating some processes of deliberative democracy and participatory democracy during the transition to democracy back in 2020, before the coup and before now the war. And we work in a lot of other contexts. And I think that's the heterogeneity of the global south, I think actually creates much more innovation ultimately than the global north, because we have many more varieties of contexts and different constraints. And I think some of the things that we've developed for, you know, for example, one of the things I'm most proud of that we developed for the Global Assembly, and you know, that came about because, you know, we realized just before the Global Assembly was starting that the information materials that was developed by the Knowledge and Wisdom group of our team was mainly text-based and didn't have, you know, they developed an animated slideshow, but it was in English with like, you know, there was no thought about how it would be used in the deliberative context of the Global Assembly. And so we were trying to think, how do you make time series data of like understandable to people from different educational backgrounds that may not be able to read or write even, that maybe have never even seen like, you can't read or write, you've definitely never seen a time series chart. But I would say even if you've only finished secondary school, there's a very low probability that you're going to understand a time series graph. You know, maybe 5 to 10% of the world population could understand a time series graph about climate change from the IPCC report. And so we developed what we called the 7th-generation anchoring exercise. We were inspired by like First Nation communities in the Iroquois community in particular, of thinking 7-generationally about issues. We centered the 7 generations with the present moment, recognizing that sort of we're addressing a historical problem that has, you know, historical causes and future implications. And sort of anchoring ourselves in the present moment was important about sort of framing the deliberation on the one hand, and framing an exercise of getting to know fellow assembly members, getting to create a vision for the future that was developed before going through the deliberative process. And then, you know, ultimately enabled us to have like a sort of time series of points that link to people's family histories. So we could say, you know, you have a chart, we could say, so when your great grandfather was born, the level of species biodiversity in your region was this, today it's this, in the future, depending on certain decisions that we take today, it might look like that. And that, for example, is a pedagogical innovation that we see like huge like possibilities for in a lot of other sectors, in education, of course, in deliberative democracy, but in a lot of other educational fields. And that was developed because we were engaging with the constraints of the Global Citizens Assembly. And so I think that the opportunity for innovation in the Global South is rich. And I think it's important that we don't allow this to sort of go into the same tendency of like, you know, global north organizations doing randomized controlled trials of medicine on poor people in certain parts of the world that have less regulatory protections and whatever else. But we do this, of course, with dignity. But I think, of course, I'm in a safe space of people that all agree on that.
Have you ever before had the chance or someone have ever asked you to talk about, or somebody else from the Central Circle, the Global Assembly, to talk about how you did these innovations and why you did these innovations? How did you get to these solutions? Have you ever had the chance to talk about that? Were you invited or were you asked, questioned about that before?
Yeah, I think unfortunately the Global Assembly is just such a, it became such, I mean, you've even seen, it was really even hard for, I never responded. We were like, there was an instance of trolling in like the Global Democracy R&D forum, for instance. It's like, it's quite a, I feel like it's quite a polarizing initiative. There's a lot of ego in our global democracy space, we have to acknowledge. And I think there were a lot of people feel very strongly about it. There some people for different reasons. Some people feel like it wasn't organized well enough or slow enough. Other people feel like, like you have the people like that believe, like, for example, Fishkin, like, that citizens are useful for their advisory input, but not for making decisions or for developing solutions. I mean, that's the whole premise of the deliberative poll, for instance. And so this idea of citizens co-creating. So I feel like the Global Assembly was quite polarizing. And then unfortunately within the Global Assembly, it was also quite polarizing. There's a quote, for example, in the current version of the evaluation that basically suggests that we sidestep pedagogical innovation. And that's because a Global North member of the Central Circle was upset that they weren't, that, like, for example, myself and other colleagues, basically I was talking about these animated slideshows. We were like, we can't use these in the Global Assembly unless you help us understand how people can understand this who are not educated, who speak different languages than English. Tell us how this is going to be useful and we'll use it. And the argument that some members of the Central Circle suggested was that this innovation is useful for learning for future global assemblies, that we've got neuroscientists to neuroscientifically optimize this. But we're like, yes, but our value is focusing on the process, not the outcome. Like, how is this useful for our process of organizing global citizens assembly? And so there was a lot of, it just became very polarized, like myself and other members of the team had to sit through several meetings where we were basically lectured about the importance of pedagogical innovation and diversity of materials, which of course we all knew, but it was just because a group wanted to push their pedagogical innovation that we didn't find useful. But I think, I mean, that's the unfortunate thing about the Global Citizens Assembly, is that, like, even I think the evaluation report that was led by, Nicole and people like Azucena and others that are very conscious of decolonizing democracy, of these dynamics, centers a lot of the innovation in the Global North. Basically, the way you read the report, it's like the intellectual effort is driven by the Global North and the labor was developed by the Global South, and neither of those characterizations are accurate. And I don't think there's a nuanced understanding of, like, all of these pieces. For me, like, I don't think that the richness and the beauty of the work of the Global Assembly has been sufficiently recognized yet. I mean, like, things like the 7th-generation anchoring exercise is, like, for me, I think, really rich. I mean, we want to use it for other things that we do at I4Policy, for example.
Yes, but in the report, sometimes I think that do you also think that maybe we don't market, we don't do marketing, so much marketing of the innovations that our solutions, our creations, and we don't make them so visible because maybe we are so worried with the political implications of our work that sometimes we don't give enough visibility, enough registration, enough, or we just have difficulties to do the documentation of these innovations and these creations. Do you think there is something that we also, not only this, I agree with you, but I'm also thinking about, for example, in Deliberative, we have never made a piece on methodological innovations, for example. We only describe the process as a political process and not the details and the things that made difference to that process in terms of some solutions that we create. So what do you think about that?
John,
You are on
we can hear you.
mute.
Sorry, I muted myself again. No, I think I completely agree. And I think it's a lot about the funding imbalances. And that's why I'm so excited about this project and why I really wanted to come and join. And I'm sorry I haven't been as involved and so far, but I really hope that this project will support more funding to be used, like, and you know, not to be like a global North organization gets funding to work with global South organizations to document learnings, but like just give money to Deliberative Brazil to like document methodological learnings. I mean, that's that simple. And I feel like we need more of that. I do feel like, and this is maybe a bit of a harsh statement, and I think that Steve Biko, the famous anti-apartheid activist in South Africa who's murdered, like he once wrote that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I do feel like we don't oftentimes, as organizations in the global South, exert enough agency about changing and developing and just positioning new things, you know? It's something I really want to encourage. Yeah, I'm excited about the work that you guys are doing on this with other partners in the global South. And I just want to encourage you guys to just like fundraise more for this work, because I feel like the more that we do this, the more it helps our peers and colleagues and others feel the agency to do more of this also. And there's just so many examples of this. I mean, how many of these standards of like any type of participatory democracy, all the lists, all the standards, it's all developed in the global North. I mean, our organizations are all headquartered in the global North in terms of these networks. Yeah, and I would love to see more of that. I hope that the work that we're going to be doing in this governance vocabularies initiative will create some opportunity to like highlight vocabularies and methodologies from the global South and start to create a space where we don't have to position like this is the new methodology, but like just this is our methodology that we found useful and maybe useful for others. And yeah, but I do think it's hard. I think it's also like the academic environment is often, there's so much like, you know, epistemological dominance from the global North. A lot of the kind of, you know, the major political conferences and whatever political science conferences are like, you know, APSA or, you know, the European Political Science Association. And I think that these spaces are often quite critical. Like I feel like the like the academic environment of a lot of this space is very like global North culture. You know, it's like very competitive and very like, you know, like in a way almost machismo. It's like you're like trying to tear apart other people's ideas, and that's not a very safe space for people that are coming in to like propose new ideas. You know, like even our space, like it's taken years. Like we've been working on something we call decision thinking, which is essentially like we developed what we call the Addis process, which is Addis, of course, the capital of Ethiopia, and Amharic, it means new. It's essentially an acronym, mnemonic device to describe the policy cycle. So it's agenda setting, drafting, decision making, implementation, sense making. And we've developed within that kind of a modern policy cycle. We believe that it's as sophisticated, if not more so, than a lot of the work that's being developed by colleagues in the global North. We've basically integrated a lot of other people's work, as well as like several years of our experience developing policy processes in a hugely diverse set of spaces. And it's taken me years to be able to like propose this as a paper. And a lot of times we talk about it, people are like, oh, like, you know, like just very dismissive of it, even though we know from our work with policymakers and practitioners around the world, including the global South, including the global North, that this is actually really useful. And so it's just that kind of, yeah, I don't know. I think we need to create more examples of organizations in the global South developing methodological innovations, and also create new spaces where these innovations can be shared that are less toxic. And then just give each other, I think, just support each other, you know. I think just really applaud and recognize and celebrate each other's achievements, I think, is really important. And I hope that I can do that for y'all, and vice versa.
John, we don't want to take too much time for you, but I think we have another question, maybe the the final question, and it's also is related with the last ideas that you were sharing with us. I don't know, maybe we have been talking more in a problematic perspective, and in the experience, we were thinking in the experience of deliberative democracy, but now I want to ask you more in a creative perspective, or thinking more in the possibilities and practices from the future. And I want to ask you what elements or practice or tools or dynamics, rules, principles, I don't know, do you think we need to strengthen the mutual learning process that actually exists? And what do you think, what elements do we need to create new successful mutual learning process? What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Santiago. I mean, it's so challenging. I think maybe what's most needed is to create, because there are so many spaces that are global north dominated. And I feel like almost in a way to kind of recognize that it's important to create some global south dominated spaces where, you know, like, you know, where you have this kind of safe space to be able to share without like all the inherent like biases. I mean, and there's many, you know, like dealing with racism in these kind of combined spaces, dealing with biases in these combined spaces, whatever. I feel like it's almost useful to have these kind of global south spaces, more of them, you know, like what Exituto did with Demo Reset, what we were super excited about, just creating these spaces where people from different regions in the global south could come together and exchange and share knowledge. I think more of that, and creating these kind of, in a way, safe spaces without global north organizations and participants, and that have a different logic and a different culture, you know, like where you really norm set, you know, kind of expected behavior of, you know, of people in the group, and how to be really supportive and generative, for example. And yeah, I think that would be really useful to kind of invest in these global south spaces that could then, you know, engage in dialogue with some of the global north spaces. And in working with some of our champions, you know, like people like I think the work that Bonnie Ibawa is doing, for example, he was leading Participedia, his recent research, for example, paper they just wrote. I mean, like just some exceptional, you know, academic colleagues that are in the global north. But I feel like otherwise creating the space really for global south practitioners and academics, yeah, it would be in a way that's not like referential, not reverential, but referential to the global north. You know, we're not referencing global north methodologies, but really creating the space to like explore our own. You know, I really would love to see, you know, like I love the work that like Marcin, for example, has created this like deliberative cafe, you know, innovation, for example, of like creating a new kind of constellation of activities that come together into like one deliberative engagement. I would just love to see more of that packaging work and stuff coming from, yeah, South America and from Africa and Asia and other places. Yeah.
Yeah, packaging is a good word. It's like the marketing thing that I was talking about too.
Okay, I don't know, Sylvia, you if you have a question about that's something that John has mentioned of Participedia, I think.
Yeah, I missed the name. Who have you talked about in Participedia? You mentioned as a good exception, right? What's the name?
Oh, his name is Bonnie Ibawo.
Okay.
He just released a beautiful paper that he's able to get. Let me just let me just see. But yeah, but you have, I mean, I think there are just many, you know, like, of course, I really respect the work of Nicole Curato. I mean, I think also like Baogang He, who is also from Deakin University, also in Australia, who's done a lot of work of deliberation in China and in Myanmar, I think brings like a much more nuanced understanding of democracy and governance and participation. And maybe that's another thing that I think we often, like Bonnie's recent work highlights this. I think one of the other big differences, to go back to the very first question, is the, of course, there's the heterogeneity, but I think the global north in this sort of homogenous, sort of more homogenous, of course, there's a lot of this difference itself, but like is much more individual rights focused. This kind of liberal sort of democracy, this idea of like the importance of the individual. And I think in the global south, there's much more of a cultural association with sort of collective rights also. And, you know, like the rights of groups and the rights of communities and the responsibilities, I think like the accountabilities that individuals have to their communities. Yeah, like, for example, in Rwanda, that drives so much of our work. And the way in which the government is accountable to people, it extracts legitimacy not just from the processes that it uses, but the governments in the regions where we work oftentimes extract their legitimacy also from the outcomes they're able to deliver for their people. And I think that's very different.
Okay, John, I don't know, Silvia, do you have any other question? I think it's,
No, very nice. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, I think that.
I think it was, you know, we say that we do a lemonade from a lemon. So it was the case. It was great to have you alone talking, and we have a lot of time with you, so we could share more ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think in this interview emerged a lot of ideas and new perspectives and also new ways of sensibility with all these problems. So thank you, John, for bringing this information to us. And as we said at the beginning of this interview, we're going to try to collect this information to build a living guidebook to publish from practitioners and citizens and all the people that need this kind of information. So we want to invite you to join the next workshops that we are going to develop, and also we are working in a co-working notebook, trying to build this text, so you are you will be very useful there. So if you want to join us, please be free to do that. But thank you very much, John, for these ideas.
I just one question actually for you guys, just to understand a bit more about the project, and thank you. I feel really, I hope it was useful. I feel also like, I don't know, I feel like I was just ramblings at some points, but I'm really wondering, Sylvia, like you mentioned about the opportunity to highlight some of the innovations in the Global Assembly. I wonder if this, like, somehow, like this notebook, if this is an opportunity for some of our Global South members in the network to say, hey, this is something that we developed for this project that we think could be useful for others. And maybe, I don't know if there's a way to encourage that or support that, or maybe that could be in future phases, but get some funding out. Like, I would really love to see, and I have to say, I've bookmarked your videos. I received it while I was on holiday last week, but I can't wait to watch your videos. And I would love to see like a Deliberative method for organizing sort of local citizens assemblies, for example, and yeah, to support the sharing of that globally. And so I wonder if this notebook is a chance to do exactly that. Like, how do we help and support and encourage some packaging that can go into this report? Or
yeah, and think about financing some systematic and intensive work of marketing Global South solutions, creations, and even adaptations that are not adaptations, are innovations as well. Great, great. We have this in mind, but please put a comment there talking about that and highlighting the points that you would love to work on. So that's good. So we will never forget, but please help us.
Yeah.
Well, if, just let me know, like, what's the, like, if, for example, add this method that I mentioned, if there's the way to kind of package and share that for the report, for example, or for others, like, let me know how that would be most useful. And I would love to contribute in that regard and how else we can be supportive for that really practically, but I'll make a note for that here in the notebook now.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, John.
You know what would be useful? If you said, like, for example, I'd love to have a project to package or some kind format, something in a good way to share the solutions, the innovations that we develop for Global Assembly. If you could try to estimate time and costs to do that, that would be great. Because then we can think about models of projects of that for the Global South, you know?
Yeah, thank you. I just love the spirit of this call. Thank you both so much. Really, it's so nice to be in like a generative space, thinking about how to address this really important topic. So I'm just grateful for the work you guys are doing. Keep it up, and counts on me. I want to support as much as I can, and I know the rest of my team would feel the same. So please just keep us up to date. Share calendar. Feel free to just share calendar invites with us directly, because sometimes like things like forums get lost. So just put it on my calendar directly, and I'll really try to be there whatever time of day it is.
Great. Thank
Yeah.
you very much, and send a hi, and thank you for the whole team of I4Policy.
I will.
Thank you, John. I
Okay,
expect
thank
to
you,
see you
Wendy.
in the next
Yeah.
activities.